Sun Tzu 兵法 The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
Everything that Sun Tzu has to say is rooted in empirical experience. He didn't make this stuff up. It was derived from experiences that he'd been through, and I can't think of anything which has a more realistic texture than that.
兵者，贵道也。All warfare is based on deception.
If something is of benefit to you as a partisan, as a guerrilla, as an irregular, then the knowledge of that is also important for the enemy, what your tactics are.
The Art of War is a military manual about how to fight war more efficiently. Its tone is at times mystical, elsewhere clinical. It's a bit like Machiavelli's The Prince, without being Machiavellian, if that makes any sense. It's become the guidebook of choice by both sides fighting what is now known as asymmetrical warfare. When American troops were searching the caverns of Tora Bora for Osama bin Laden, it's said they found a copy of it there, a myth worthy of the book itself. It would have been familiar to the Americans, for they were taught its principles at West Point Military College. It was also read with interest in a completely different institution, Long Kesh Prison in Northern Ireland. At the end of the 1960s, Northern Ireland was descending into chaos as sectarian violence flared out of control. Members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, condemned as terrorists, were interned in Long Kesh without trial in the 1970s. IRA activist Danny Morrison was imprisoned there. He would later become Sinn Fein's National Director of Publicity. He's now a writer. In prison, he read voraciously.
It was a fella from North Belfast who was later assassinated who actually had the book. It was a very small book. I remember reading it. It was full of aphorisms. Initially, you'd say, he's stating the obvious. But the very fact that it was being stated and treated seriously, some of them seemed to be paradoxical and ambiguous, but at the same time, I found it inspirational, almost like a fire. It was very, very powerful, brilliant. When I was reading other books, I think there was some books by Che Guevara, of course, Machiavelli's Prince, even in a novel like I, Claudius by Robert Graves, you find that the strategies that are been spoken about in that book, deceptiveness.
Alongside Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Campaign or Clausewitz's highly influential On War, inspired by the Napoleonic Wars, The Art of War is one of the classic books on war. It stood the test of time. It was written almost 2,500 years ago, just before the Peloponnesian Wars were being fought by the ancient Greeks. The author was Sun Tzu, a Chinese general. He lived and fought during the chaos that followed the death of Confucius in 479 BC. It was the period of the warring states, but they weren't nation-states as we know them. Regional warlords had consolidated their power into 3 rival clans who used extreme violence and were engaged in a perpetual war of each against all. At Reading University's School of Politics and International Studies, I spoke with Lieutenant General Sir Robert Fry, who served in Northern Ireland and was Deputy Commander, Multinational Force in Iraq. He describes himself simply as a former soldier. But firstly, I asked Dr. Geoffrey Sloan, a lecturer at Reading, about those turbulent times in China.
You have the development in this age of the warring states of what perhaps you could, to make an analogy with a later period, of a series of itinerant Machiavellis. You were rewarded by the rulers in a number of ways. If you were unsuccessful, you usually met a rather brutal and untimely death.
Wow, so there's a market for this.
That there is a market in operational know-how and strategic ideas.
You weren't fighting for reasons of destiny, you were fighting for reasons of expediency. And therefore, what you probably needed was a handbook to tell you precisely how to do that. And I think one of the interesting things about the book, and it's exactly true of Clausewitz in On War as well, is that he mixes the semi-spiritual with the really gritty tactical.
近而视之远，远而视之近。When we're near, we must make the enemy believe we are far. When far, we must make him believe we are near.
Simple things like don't attack crack troops. We were a very small army, poorly armed in comparison to the enemy, that had helicopters and access to radio transmitters. So we had to turn everything around and in fact use our small numbers to our advantage. There's expressions that he uses in the book about hiding the deepest depths of the earth. The IRA have done things wrong here. Sun Tzu also says, do not replicate a military victory. The IRA in the 1987, for example, was using diggers and attacking barracks, and they repeated that operation. And as a result, 8 volunteers were killed at Loughgall by the SAS because they saw a pattern developing. So, I mean, obviously there are vital lessons to be learned from a close study of the book.
利而诱之，乱而取之。Hold out baits to entice the enemy. Feign disorder and crush him.
For example, they think that they're recovering an arms dump, only for them to be walking into a trap. This is where actually you can also use an informer. If you can turn an informer, you can lure the enemy, agents or handlers, into a position where they can be attacked.
So it's like double cross.
Fight rationally, not emotionally, because that's when you make mistakes. If you do something from an emotional point of view, you're weak at that point, and your enemy is strong, regardless of the symmetry or asymmetry between you and your opponent.
怒而绞之，悲而骄之，义而劳之，亲而离之。If your opponent is in anger, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant.
What was My Lai all about?
The massacre.
The massacre in Vietnam. This was an insensate response to a formless battlefield. And Sun Tzu would have recognized this perfectly, which then had profound implications in terms of turning America against the war. Always use as dispassionate and intellectual approaches as possible. I mean, maybe the events of the first decade of the 21st century give a really good illustration of this. The attack on the Twin Towers took place, and arguably the first decade of the 21st century was characterized by 2 overreactions. First of all, the military overreaction to that attack, and then later a fiscal overreaction to the events of the fall of Lehman Brothers. Now, on 2 occasions, where maybe detached intellectual analysis was lost and a visceral, emotional response took place, well, history will be the judge. We have these sort of semi-spiritual aphorisms, but actually at the heart of what Sun Tzu is saying is profound rationalism. And I think in many ways it's the rise of asymmetric warfare, where the weaker party looks for the mechanisms whereby it can overthrow the inherent strengths of the stronger party, that Sun Tzu really comes into his own.
微乎微乎，止于无形；神乎神乎，止于无声。故能为敌之司命。Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness, invisible and silent. That is how we kill our enemy.
In a typical situation where we were in conflict with the British Army, by and large they were in uniform, although they used undercover people. The IRA mixed with the public, operated with the public, did not wear uniforms. That's where the formlessness comes in. And of course they tried to demoralise the community. By and large they had the media on their side, yet they could not defeat the IRA because the IRA was continually inventive. We didn't take control of like 30 square miles of terrain with the enemy couldn't come into. The enemy was everywhere, but so were we. And it was because we were invisible.
善守者，藏于九地之下；善攻者，动于九天之上。Those skilled at defense hide in the deepest depth of the earth. Those skilled in attack move in the highest heights of the sky.
Often, for example, they would keep a helicopter, maybe 2 or 3 helicopters up in the air, even though they didn't know what you were doing, and that was to act as a deterrent. So that was a different use of it, the exact opposite use of it. Whereas they weren't being stealthy, they were being obvious. And you had to wonder to yourself, do they know what we are doing today, or is that a bluff? So there are reversals of the expression as well.
您正在收听的是《孙子兵法》，BBC 国际广播电台。You're listening to The Art of War on BBC World Service.
The first response of the more powerful actor is to try and take on the weaker party on a formed battlefield. Because, of course, he will have preponderant force and is likely simple correlation of forces to be successful. If, however, the weaker party proves elusive, then the stronger party has to change his ground. And that's why, in recent years, things like information operations, which is why things like investment in governance and the economy have become just as important as defeating the enemy on the battlefield, because these are indirect mechanisms of engagement which are fundamentally about recruiting the population. And it is the population which is normally the target in these formless engagements.
More than just PR.
Oh, more than just PR. It has to be more than PR. If it's just PR, then it's seen through immediately. It has to be substantive.
One of the ways you can understand Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, is to see it as a series of aphorisms. An aphorism is not a philosophical concept, it's a linguistic concept, and therefore, by its very nature, it eternalizes itself. What we have from Sun Tzu is wisdom. The critics of Sun Tzu have come back and said, yes, well, it looks very simple, but how do you actually do it? You have what's called Tao, the path of the way, and there's a balance, I suppose, between lightness and darkness. There's a kind of a balance. And then there's the kind of Shen, which means confidence. Another way of describing, I suppose, the philosophical origins is a path or a way that you can have confidence in.
At one level, Sun Tzu is no more than a sort of a pretty bad addition to a New Age bookshop. With lots of bits of enduring Chinese wisdom. So, that's dead right. But if you look at, let's look at Clausewitz for a second. Clausewitz makes the observation, and again it sounds like an aphorism, all things in war are simple, but even the simplest things are difficult because of the concept of friction. But once you embark on things where you test your will against an enemy, then all sorts of things can happen. And in those circumstances, sometimes it is the simplest sort of aphorism that actually gives you an awful lot of insight, rather than complex formulaic solutions of how to get out of them.
The enemy's spies who have come to spy on us must be tempted with bribes, turned and work for us. From these converted spies, we can acquire new spies within their officials.
Sun Tzu's got a lot to write about spies of one sort or another.
Well, I was a person who was sentenced to 8 years in jail on the word of an informer. Ironically, all sides require informers because information is vital. The IRA has recruited people from within the opposition, but interestingly, the IRA never boasts about that because that is a weakness. You have to protect your informers. In our case here, informers from within our community were weak people, were people who were either blackmailed or bribed. It's up to the IRA to defend itself, and the IRA probably put to death, I'm not sure, maybe 50 or 60 of its own people who were discovered to be acting as informers. It had to do it in order to defend the organisation.
监视未发而先闻者，监于所告者皆死。If a secret piece of news is divulged by a spy before the time is ripe, he must be put to death, together with the man to whom the secret was told.
What Sun Tzu gives us is a typology of human intelligence. He develops a collective phrase, the divine skin. They are the treasure of the sovereign.
It's a wonderful phrase. That it's an absolute cracker.
And the most important is the double agent. that one of the ways in which you get a double agent is quite simple, is that you bribe him lavishly and that he is taken in, as Sun Tzu calls, into the tent of the general. But of course, in the 20th century, and we shouldn't criticize them, it's just the way in which world history has evolved. In the 20th century, of course, you have double agents who are motivated purely by ideology. The best example, I think, are the Cambridge Five, dedicated to the Soviet Union and to communism. Sun Tzu talks about a living agent you would describe as someone like James Bond, that he must be able to endure humiliation, hunger, filth, etc. The inside agent, this is someone who is perhaps inside an enemy bureaucracy. And again, Sun Tzu, with great insight, describes almost the characteristics of this person who would be suitable for recruitment, because he maintains that the inside agent may have been passed over for promotion. The double agent will know about this because he will have come over from the other side, and therefore he'll know who to contact.
But these are means to an end. And the end is knowledge of the enemy. Now, again, the position that Sun Tzu always sought was co-equal knowledge of the enemy and of self. And if you're in possession of the enemy and in possession of self-knowledge, then you are guaranteed success on the battlefield. Going back to the double agent again, I mean, there are people who do this for reasons of the highest principle.
So it's not just a matter of being a traitor?
It's not just a matter of being a traitor. It's not just a matter of being bribed. And I think I'd use the example, Danny Morrison has talked about Northern Ireland. Some of the sources that the British used in Northern Ireland were people who chose to inform on the IRA for matters of the highest principle, because they became fundamentally alienated from the movement, or they felt that force was being used in an utterly indiscriminate manner. So I think that some of the traditional, rather inimical descriptions of double agents are not always true.
And a dangerous business?
Oh, mightily dangerous business, as history attests.
主不可以怒而行师，将不可以运而制战。怒可以复喜，运可以复悦。亡国不可以复存，死者不可以复生。No king should go to war in anger. No general should engage in fighting out of spleen. Anger may in time change to joy. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never come again into being. The dead cannot be brought back to life.
Is this just idealism or realism?
No, I think it's realism, because I think that you've got to have a basis upon which to reconstitute society, and even an enemy society will probably rise again in some form or another. So the more punitive you are in terms of the damage that you cause it, then the more likely you are to have a successor conflict. And maybe the perfect example here is the Versailles Peace at the end of the First World War, which created the circumstances for the Second World War.
People often try to separate out, I think, the process of fighting war and peace are two sort of hermetically sealed concepts. They're not. I think they're intimately connected with one another.
How do you know when you win, then? How do you know when you win?
I suppose come back to this kind of Clausewitzian notion of war as a duel, and that you impose your will on the enemy.
That's a traditional Clausewitzian idea which the 20th century would recognise. Possession of the capital of the enemy, defeat of the enemy's fielded forces. The 21st century would not necessarily recognise that. And I think that the key arbiter of success in this century is the compliance of the population.
Our liberated territory was in here and in here. It was in our hearts, it was in our heads, because we were inspired by our resistance and by our stubbornness. The IRA did not win, but the IRA did not lose. One of the rubrics, I suppose, of classical guerrilla warfare, to live and fight another day. But in our case, we had to compromise. The IRA did not drive the British Army into the sea. But on the other hand, we have a situation now where Martin McGuinness, who's former commander of the IRA, is likely to be the First Minister in the next Assembly elections. And so we have a situation where the guerrillas fought and now the guerrillas are in government.
If you were to win victory, but at the price of the destruction of civic society, what use is that victory to you? And what basis is there for subsequent regeneration and reconciliation?
Pretty strong argument against the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, pretty strong argument for the application of nuclear deterrence.
Do you think any of the factions read Sun Tzu?
If I look back to the campaign in Iraq, different cultural tradition. The American army certainly did.
I was actually going to ask you. That was the next question.
Well, I think that, even
of the generals, which one read Sun Tzu?
Well, even the most sort of ardent Al Qaeda militant might be open to the charge of apostasy if he was involved reading texts from an entirely alternative cultural tradition. So I think on the insurgent side, probably not a lot. Had they read it, however, I'm sure they would have seen an awful lot of reference points that they would have seen resemble the situation they found themselves in.
There's actually a T-shirt brought out several years ago in which it said, "I went to the University of Long Kesh."
Who benefits from reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War?
Well, anybody that's interested in the history of warfare, or who is involved in warfare, or who wishes to avoid warfare.
One word you'll not find in The Art of War is sorry. It's notable that when the fighting's over and peace breaks out, how long it takes, if at all, for the protagonist to come out and make an unqualified apology to the families of those they killed.
Sun Tzu's ultimate warrior never has to fight. As he puts it, supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. That's something that generals, intelligence services, and the politicians would all agree with, even if it sometimes doesn't work out that way.
Know thyself and know the enemy. 知己知彼，百战不殆。